When you buy a game, how much of it do you actually own? Games are a unique type of media because they're composed of files. Files can be edited, leading users to create brand new things, both inside the game and out.
I thought, instead of just playing the video games, how about I try to make something with them?
Modding and other forms of user-generated content are so ubiquitous in gaming spaces, you might not even question it at this point. This is a video about creative people stretching the definition of the word consumer when it comes to the games they buy and how they use them. It's an exploration into the many possibilities, both celebrated and controversial, and an examination on just where the limits are.
Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's right.
Mod is short for modification, so it's when you modify your game to allow for things the developers didn't originally include in the retail version. Mods can be small changes like adding new weapons and armor, but they can also be more substantial, like adding new areas and levels, or even entirely new stories. The first sizable modding community started with 1993's Doom. The game was deliberately designed in a way that allowed new content to be added through the use of a file format called WAD, or Where's My Data, that was separate from the game's technical framework, or engine. Modding didn't originate with Doom, but its ease of access compared to most earlier games made it a huge hit and inspired countless players to make their own mods over the years, a trend that still goes on to this day. Take, for instance, myhouse.wad, released in 2023. What starts out as an in-game recreation of someone's house, a popular trend for beginners in the Doom modding community, quickly becomes an expansive horror story that accomplishes more than many thought was possible within Doom's engine. It was such an impressive feat, the mod was even played by Doom's designer, John Romero.
Look at that escalator. What is going on? Wow.
That brings us to an important point. Mods don't go unnoticed by developers. When making their very first game, Half-Life, Valve hired Quake modders to join the development team because of their understanding of the Quake engine. And when Valve made Source, their own engine that they used for subsequent games, they released comprehensive tools that made it accessible for modders so they could create their own content. Valve continues to hire modders experienced in their engine even now. Another company deeply involved with the modding scene is Bethesda, the creators of the Elder Scrolls and Fallout games. Like Valve, they made their toolkit accessible to players, and that fostered a large modding community.
I loved Fallout 3. I really enjoyed playing it, but it just wasn't the Fallout experience that I was looking for. And me and my buddy Steven had sat down, and we're just talking about what would we like to see in a Fallout game.
That's Brandon Lee, from Radiant Helix, the creator of one of the biggest Fallout mods ever released, Fallout New California. When most people are underwhelmed by a game, they might think about what could have been and move on. But Brandon started working to bring it into reality. In 2010, he began work on an ambitious project, a whole new story set in the Fallout universe. It would feature warring factions and conflicts inspired by the political climate at the time.
People in the admin office think Bragg's not content with taking over as overseer by popular vote.
I kind of embodied my feelings of the way things were headed into Overseer Christensen and Colonel Bragg. So Bragg's, we're going to bring America back to glory, and we're going to retake the wasteland and get this world straightened back out. There's that jingoism was just like a pure expression of like the American zeitgeist at the time.
I'm here to represent democracy and the American way.
And setting up this dichotomy in there where you have a bunch of choices that you can make, and that's ultimately going to shape not just your fate, but the fate of the people of the wasteland.
Fallout New California would be an expansive new world and storyline, with tons of different options and branches, and it would be made with the GEC, the modding toolkit provided by Bethesda.
I love it, because it is a phenomenal piece of technology, as fucked up as it is. If you want to build an open-world role-playing game, the tools that Bethesda have made are the shit. You can take those editor tools that these big companies release, and you can do what the companies do. You can make a game from scratch without having to do everything from scratch. You can inherit the models and all the code bases and all the architecture and all that stuff, and then you can distribute it to players, and that's just the dopest thing ever.
Even with the robust toolkit, making New California was a colossal undertaking, one that blurred the lines between a mod and an original game. And to add on to that, for most of its development, it was only a two-man team. It required tremendous effort and sacrifices in order to complete it.
I describe it as going into exile. I quit life, is the best way to describe it.
Development on the project lasted from 2010 to 2018, switched games from Fallout 3 to New Vegas, and suffered numerous delays and setbacks, but ultimately released to widespread acclaim. It was even played by Josh Sawyer, the director and lead designer of Fallout New Vegas, on a charity livestream.
Josh Sawyer finally played it. He and Mickey sat down and they just murder hoboed their way through New California. And I was just the game didn't break.
Wow, incredible job.
New California stands out as a strong example of the transformative and artistic capabilities of a mod, something that pushes what you would expect from user-generated content to its limits, and highlights a facet of the interesting relationship between game studios and modders. But modding is only one of the ways in which players have created something new with their favorite games. This is Blood Gulch, a multiplayer map in the original Halo Combat Evolved from 2001. However, there are many people out there who know it better from something outside the game.
Hey, yeah? You ever wonder why we're here?
This map is the main setting of Red vs. Blue, a web series that started in 2003 when a small group of friends working under the name Rooster Teeth discovered that looking all the way down in-game gave the impression that the player character had lowered their weapon. From there, they wrote, recorded, and voice-acted short episodes where they puppeteered the characters around and parodied Halo. Although they didn't know it when they were first making it, it's part of a broader style of filmmaking called Machinima, or machine cinema, that involves using video games to create films. The first machinima ever created is called Diary of a Camper, and it was made with Quake. It's very rudimentary, but it demonstrated that games could be used for something more than just playing. As the technology behind games progressed, so did machinimas. Due in part to early shows like Red vs. Blue, machinima exploded in popularity in the mid to late 2000s and became a staple of many gaming communities.
It was that really kind of got me interested in using games to make videos. And that all kind of came to a head when eventually in 2012, while I was in high school, a program called the Source Filmmaker came out, and I got hooked on it basically right away.
That's Anomidae. He has a YouTube channel where he makes animations and short films using game characters. Source Filmmaker is a 3D animation program powered by Valve's Source Engine that allows users to make their own animations with the same technology Valve used to create theirs. It's built specifically for Valve's own games, but over the years, users have added their own custom models or imported models from other games. Creators like Anomidae, though, still stick with Valve's intellectual property.
Making a world or putting together an idea or a concept from scratch is incredibly difficult, and it's very expensive. SFM offered an unparalleled level of here's some worlds that you can work with to make a video. Here's a bunch of characters that are fully rigged that you can animate, and you can make it look really good.
Throughout the years, he's made many animations as well as tutorials for how to use the program. Right now, he has an ongoing series on his channel called Interloper, which has become extremely popular.
The very first video in that series that I made was made over the course of about 2.5 days. Although the idea was not. The idea was something that had been cooking for at least 2.5 years.
It's hard to believe it was done in such a short amount of time, because Interloper is an elaborate combination of in-game footage and SFM animations that coalesce in an engaging horror story. about an undiscovered secret in Half-Life 2 that ends up expanding to nearly all of Valve's gameography.
It kind of starts falling out of the realm of machinima a little bit, I think. But at its core, it really is machinima. It's stuff that's made in-engine, and it's all about taking an idea and rendering it to video. And that's something that I think video games are pretty attuned to doing, especially for something like Interloper, where it's more meta-narrative than anything else.
While mods create something new inside the game, machinima and animations like Anomidae showcase how games can be used to create new works in an entirely different medium. Based on everything shown, you might conclude that modding, machinima, and other fan creations are embraced and even celebrated by developers. The reality is, it's not that simple.
Modders are not under NDA, the company doesn't control them, and they can abuse and possibly intertangle your intellectual property with questionable things. I think we all know what questionable means in the context of modding.
Well, what does that mean? Game companies providing modding toolkits are more of the exception than the rule. For a significant amount of games, if someone wants to make a mod, they'll have to develop the tools for it themselves, or rely on other players that have done it. To add to that, many companies flat out don't want their games modded at all. There are reasons for this. No Alphabets is a mod pack developed for Baldur's Gate 3 with the goal of removing all queer characters from the game. It deletes any references to queer relationships, accomplishing it by swapping characters' genders and using AI to redo their voice lines. And it even adds new text to indicate a transgender character detransitioned. It's definitely not the only type of this mod that you'll find. Make Space Great Again, Play as Europeans Only is a mod for Stellaris that removes people of color from your faction, as well as takes women out of leadership roles. You get the picture. Mods are user-generated content, and the user could have nefarious intentions. And even if it's not something as overtly horrible as some of these extreme examples, a modder can implement something into the game that doesn't represent the values of the company behind it. That doesn't even cover what's possible when you take models out of the game and use them in software like SFM or Blender.
I grew up playing Tekken and thought they were hot, which isn't really abnormal considering Tekken is universally known to make good-looking characters.
That's TechSex. He's a beginner 3D artist and animator who mostly uses models of the characters from the fighting game Tekken to make pornography. That's also not his actual voice. He didn't feel comfortable with the spoken interview for obvious reasons. I can't show his work, but his favorite is one of Julia from Tekken getting a triple KO.
Whether people want to admit it, people have been interested in porn-related products for centuries, whether that be erotic novels, clubs, etc.
He's right about that because there's an enormous community for adult content made with game characters. Ken Levine, the director of BioShock Infinite, even begged people to stop making adult content with the character Elizabeth, and that was in 2013. As the tools have gotten better and more not safe for work creators have emerged, it's not unlikely that other game developers share similar sentiments.
It's understandable they feel that way. It's their creation, almost like a child to them, so it probably feels uncomfortable for them. At the end of the day, though, they are fictional characters, and I don't really see who it's harming.
It may not be harming anyone, certainly not in the way that the mods we previously discussed are, but some companies are still concerned about it harming their game's reputation. Overwatch is one of the biggest multiplayer shooters out there, and it's also by far the most popular game for adult artists and animators to work with. So much so that in the past, Activision Blizzard made an effort to send cease and desist orders to many of them. That was before the game was even released, when people were using the models from the game's open beta. TechSex told me he's witnessed adult content featuring the characters from Dead or Alive get removed recently.
Yeah, there's been some people in the not safe for work community that have been getting their work removed on Twitter because the company has been taking action on it for some reason. It's funny because Dead or Alive is sort of known for their provocative characters.
There is another important detail here that needs to be addressed though, and that's that many of these animators are doing it for money. Some of them are earning substantial amounts. On the other hand, most modders don't charge for their mods, though they may provide a place for people to donate. It's less out of the goodness of their own heart and more to stay out of the crosshairs of litigious companies. For example, when Microstar, a software company, began selling discs with Duke Nukem 3D mods, they were taken to court by the game's publisher. However, not all companies are hostile to creators trying to earn money. Microsoft and Bungie gave Red vs. Blue permission to be monetized, with DVDs of it even being sold in stores and online. In 2015, Valve allowed people to monetize their mods on the Steam Workshop. And in 2017, Bethesda introduced the Creation Club, a service where they professionally contracted modders to create mods for their games. But both of these backfired because paid mods are a whole mess in themselves, one that could be the subject of an entirely different video. Late in the process of working on this video, Bethesda actually revived their paid mod program, and the community seems divided over it.
You fostered a community that genuinely enjoys a modding community that's been free for a majority of their adult life. They've never seen a situation where it's not been free, and you gave a mouse a cookie and they're not going to want to give it up. Even if we're all starving to death, they don't really care. That doesn't factor into the consumer mindset, right?
Even if it didn't go over well, it's still companies supporting modders to the extent of compensating them for their work. That's a far cry from the way a lot of companies aggressively protect their intellectual property, whether monetized or not. Nintendo, for example, is notorious for striking fan animations and mods of any kind, regardless of content, to keep tight control over their intellectual properties. Even aside from questionable material or copyright issues, companies like Capcom officially consider all mods to be a form of cheating across the board, and do what they can to stop them. All of this may seem really inconsistent. Some companies seem to encourage mods in Machinima, others seem to work hard to prevent them. Can they really pick and choose what constitutes copyright infringement? What is the actual standing of any of this? If we want to take a look at who owns a game, the answer lies with one of the first things we see when we start to play one. This is an End-User License Agreement, or EULA. Most EULAs directly state that modifying the game's files is prohibited, and that anything created with the game is property of the publisher. Games that do make an exception for modding, like Bethesda titles, usually have a separate EULA just for their modding toolkit that has its own limitations. Some generous EULAs will give the okay and even allow for monetization of fan content, but will specifically note that this privilege can be taken away at any time. If you press play on a game, you've accepted these policies. Additional guidelines might be provided when it comes to user-generated content. For example, Microsoft has its game content usage rules, and Activision Blizzard lays out a series of guidelines on their website. In Microstar vs. FormGen Inc., the court case centered around the Duke Nukem mod mentioned earlier, the game's publisher, FormGen, won the case because the mod was found to be a derivative work. This ruling is one of the few that exist around modding, and that could still be applicable to mods even if they're not sold at all. Regardless of how much is new or transformative, mods, Machinima, and other fan content are legally considered derivative works. Even if they're allowed, or ignored, it doesn't mean it's not copyright infringement. It just means that the company that owns the copyright has chosen not to enforce it. The power is in their hands, and they can be as selective as they want with it.
It definitely sucks when you realize that when you're animating and you're making stuff about a video game that you're kind of at the whim of a video game company. Like, there's a company over your head that can make any decision they want about what you're doing, even if what you're doing is trying to make a career or trying to do something sustainable.
It does beg the question of why certain companies have a more hands-off approach while others don't.
That one might come down to the individuals who are behind the companies. A lot of early Valve was made up of people who made mods. It was people who didn't like the rigid corporate structure of Microsoft getting together with a bunch of modders and then just making a game together. That sort of has shaped the company culture.
Brandon says it's similar for Bethesda.
They love their modding community because they love mods themselves. You can be as cynical as you want towards the company. You can think the absolute worst of them. They produce modding tools because they love having modding capabilities in their games.
Mods in Machinima exist in a weird gray area, one that hasn't really been tested and is highly dependent on the specific company's attitude. In essence, how much of a game you actually own is however much the company behind it lets you. I wanted to get their thoughts on the matter. But first, an important disclaimer. Both Brandon and Anomidae are professionals, and their statements aren't official and don't reflect any actual workplace policies. These are purely their opinions.
I both make video game content videos, and I also do work in the video game industry. So I'm on both sides. I know what it's like from both directions. If you're a game developer and you're spending years of your life dedicated to making something really good, it almost does feel like you should have control over that. You don't want to be totally hands-off once it goes out into the ether. But on the other hand, you can't really control what people do with your games. I tend to find that there's a lot more positivity in being more lenient towards things like Machinima, being more lenient towards things like modding.
I genuinely believe, just in my heart of hearts, that if you own anything, if you paid for it and it's yours, clearly it's yours, be it software or your motorbike or your car or your house, if you own it, you have the right to modify it as you see fit. And you have the right to repair it too.
Valve, I think, proves that if you're lenient and you let people work with your games in the long term, then you kind of help ensure that that game is going to live for 10, 15 plus years. Like, you can just look back at the original Counter-Strike. That game still has a community in its entirety because it has been supporting modding since the very beginning. And it's still alive. And it'll probably be alive for another 20 years. And that's not an exaggeration. There will still be some people playing it because there's always still more to get from it.
Almost everything that we enjoy came from people who had leisure time investing it in acts of wonder and discovery and creation. If you make an environment where it is dangerous to do that, you're screwing yourself, you're screwing future generations, and you're screwing the people that you ultimately owe because they're your customers.
Mods and other forms of user-generated content are in an uncertain place, operating on an ever-changing, shaky ground. But it's possible that its mercurial state is something that could change as the industry itself changes.
I have a bit of hope that the younger generation of people getting into game development, people my age and lower who are just now getting in, considering that we've, grown up with modding being a thing and it existing in the ecosystem, that maybe this is the kind of problem that younger generations of developers will solve, having literally grown up playing a mod for Half-Life 2 for most of my free time. That's a sentiment that I'm gonna take with me until the end of time. How many more people getting in are gonna be just like that?
Thank you to Brandon Lee from Radiant Helix, Anomidae, and TechSex for talking to me. Radiant Helix has a board game out called Propaganda, and is currently working on a new video game called Project Morningstar. Anomidae is continuing to post to his YouTube channel, and is working on some experimental videos he's excited to share. TechSex is still posting on Twitter, and a lot of other websites I probably can't say or recommend on YouTube. This video was a big undertaking, far bigger than any of my previous ones, so if you want to see more like this, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Thank you so much for watching, and please consider hitting like and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already.